Let's play a dead game. And today, we're going to talk about traits. And not just, well, yes, we're going to talk about traits on the whole, but before we get to that, the way we get to traits on the whole and what they are, what they could be, and how they just kind of contribute to the game right now in general, and again, how they could contribute to the game. We have to talk about what traits are, the vast majority of traits are, as well as discuss sort of a subset of traits. Because there really are sort of two different kinds of traits. And the one kind of trait, the vast majority of traits belong to one kind, and this is like sort of the less intuitively designed and slap-on kind of they just happen and no one can do anything about them traits. And the other kind is traits that actually really hinge on activation. That is something that maybe opponents can see happen, or that have some sort of signal, or that players that take those traits can actually control those activations. And those are very, just in general, the more intuitively designed traits. I mean, when we talk about traits in general, when you talk about traits in general in Guild Wars 2, the vast majority, like I said, you're probably going to give an example of something like a passive proc that just happens on an RNG trigger, or something that activates at a certain conditional threshold, like your hit points falling to a certain level, or an enemy's hit points falling to a certain level, or yeah, or things like that. So when we talk about those kinds of traits, though, they're problematic in multiple ways, because not only can, in general, traits, no one can actually see the traits that you took. When you go into PvP or just anywhere in general, and you just engage and you just run up to combat, because I mean, combat in general, you don't, even though people may not start exchanging skills until you're within range of skill activation, combat really does start at like 3,000 range when you start seeing the guy. Like, you start planning and thinking in your head, what am I going to do? Hopefully. I mean, unless you're like a thief, because then you just like run into range and press buttons, or like an engineer and the same thing. Well, like most classes, I suppose. But in any case, there's a bit of a sizing up to be done at like 3,000 range, 2,000 range. But whatever you're doing at that point, there's almost no way of determining what traits that opponent player has. Despite the fact that many times it's heavily implied that, oh, well, this guy is just this class, so the meta is this, so he's going to be disgusting and running these traits. So there's sort of that sense of a giveaway, but we don't really know. There's absolutely no way to tell until the guy just starts hitting you, and then things start happening, and we just have to sort of deal with it. Now this creates a couple problems. Those traits create a couple problems. One problem is the problem I just discussed. There's no legibility. No one has any idea what you've taken. No one has any idea how to counterplay until the traits actually start proccing on you. So there's no way to counterplay any sort of offensively taken trait, like incendiary powder, or any sort of thing like defy pain. You can't counterplay. There's no dodging. There's no interrupting. It just happens, and you can't do anything about it. The counterplay for like something like defy pain is running in circles for 4 seconds, like, because you can't counterplay its proc. Or the counterplay for incendiary powder is to heal. It's not dodging, it's not blocking, it's not blinding the guy, it's not interrupting. You have to face tank it and then deal with it later. It's awful. So there's not only that issue for combat, because it just kind of clogs up combat legibility in general, and it just makes for unfair procs, but there are many times where those exact traits that I just discussed, not even the player that took those traits can control those traits' activations. They just happen, because they're tied to thresholds or RNG procs. The player can't say, I want incendiary power to pop on this guy and not on that guy. Well, maybe you have an AoE going, and it just hit someone randomly, and it wasn't the guy that you wanted. Well, too bad, because that's just how the game plays. Welcome to Guild Wars 2, son. In any case. So those are the real two big issues with traits. The vast majority of traits is that they're based on RNG procs, or they trigger at certain thresholds that players just really often can't control. But now there's a bit of a saving grace, in that there are other traits that exist in this game that really do hinge on actual activation. These are traits that players themselves actually that are tied to skills, rather. These are traits that are tied to skills, or some sort of like unique activation or unique condition, like dodging, or like, oh, you dodged something so you get this, or you swapped weapons so you get that. I mean, you're technically pressing a button, and granted, some are more broken because they give you a lot more for the bang. You get a lot more bang for your buck for pressing like a button when there's almost nothing to be done about like swapping weapons. Like, whoopee, I swapped weapons. Like, there's something to be said about giving too much reward for that, but I mean, that's a whole different thing. At least though, at the very least, the guy pressed a button. Like, that actually says a lot. When the vast majority of traits in this game, you don't actually really have to press any buttons outside of like the auto attack to get them to go off. It's pretty disgusting. In any case though, we're going to talk about those traits, the saving grace traits. And one in particular I have equipped right now, Wall of Reflection. And if we go into my traits, and these aren't actually my normal traits, I'm just like goofing around because I've been looking at a couple things and doing a little bit of research, I guess, but you could say research. In any case though, I have Master of Consecrations equipped right now because I like the cooldown duration, I like the cooldown reduction and the duration increase. Because it's nice. I mean, Wall of Reflection is really good. So I take that trait. And notice, if I take traits and just kind of flop around, even go back to them, there's nothing actually happening to this skill. When we talk about like changing skills and things like that, you can notice that a lot of this is the animation that goes on when you change skills, or even when you swap weapons rather. There's that flipping motion that sort of tells you that, oh yes, there is a different skill in this slot now. This thing is entirely different now, and you're gonna get something obviously that wasn't in that place before. That's just how that function works, and that's the animation that they chose to display that. In any case though, you notice that we aren't getting that when we're going through a bunch of these different traits. Even like I said, this single trait right here that technically affects the skill. However, there's also this other trait, which we call Consecrated Ground. Consecrated Ground, well, consecrations in general are skills that are technically PB AoEs. They just activate on top of the Guardian. Taking Consecrated Ground allows them to be ground targeted with, I think, a range of like 900 or something. But in any case, if we take that trait, we watch Wall of Reflection, and it flips. And not only does it flip, it also gains like the little target reticle around the letter that you, or the key that you bound it to down here, which signals that it's ground targeting. But more importantly is we get that flipping action. And if we go back and forth between other traits, we get that flipping action again. That flipping action tells us that the skill has been completely changed. That the functionality at its core has been changed. And that's true. We went from a PB AoE to an AoE. A ground targeted AoE, a GT AoE rather, if you want to go with that one. And this isn't the only kind of trait that does this. There's quite a few skill centric traits that they do completely change the functionality in some ways, but more importantly, they incite that flipping action with the skill on the skill bar. And we have things like, we have traits that change PB AoEs to GT AoEs, such as Consecrated Ground or Focused Rituals for Wells on Necro. We also have some AoE radii increase traits, such as Blasting Staff, except it doesn't affect Meteor Shower because it doesn't affect the overall size of the Meteor Shower, but instead the meteors. And it also flips the skills on Greater Marks for Necro Staff. But if you notice, I have right here, if you notice, this is the number 4 skill, this is Symbol of Wrath for Guardian Greatsword. I have the greater symbol size equipped trait. And if you notice, I go back and forth between this and number 4 isn't flipping. So there's probably some sort of development thing that like at one point they were like, oh well, we have to write code for like new skills if we want to increase the radii on them. And then maybe at one point they were like, well, we figured out how to smooth the process so we don't have to actually write new skill codes or like write out new skills because the code's different. We'll never know, because ANet's just like locked up like the Catholic Church voting on the Pope about this stuff. Like no one no one knows. We just have to wait for the smoke. We also have range increase skills. Rifled Barrels is an example of this, except it doesn't flip for overcharge shot, despite affecting the range on it. And Blowtorch just is not affected at all, which it's kind of weird, but I mean, whatever. We also have outright functionality changes. Grenadier is an example of an outright functionality change. when equipping Grenadier, grenade skills become completely different than what they were. And, I mean, there's plenty to be said about, like, the depth of the change. Oh boy, it's one more grenade. It's like, it's so complex, and it was such good design, guys. I mean, like, there's plenty to be said about, like, how bad the design behind Grenadier is. But the fact is, though, that taking Grenadier, if you have Grenade Kit, not only if you have Grenade Kit open, it flips all of the skills, but Grenadier is an example of a trait that functionally changes the entire way that skill behaves. Those are the traits that are really good for this game. Those are the traits, because they're tied to skills, aren't things that go proccing randomly, aren't things that cannot be counterplayed by just things that actually have no counterplay. Like, the counterplay is either just face tanking it or running around in circles. And more importantly, because they're tied to skills, the player that took that trait, I took Consecrated Ground, for instance, but, like, I took Consecrated Ground, and I'm in control of this skill proc. I'm in control of this trait proc, rather. I mean, it's not really a proc anymore, but it's sort of, since it's tied to this skill, though, I'm in complete control. I'm in complete control of that trait, as opposed to something like a RMG proc or a threshold proc, where it just happens and I just have to deal with it sometimes. And the reason why we're here is actually to talk to this cat, because this cat is in charge of a heart, and this cat gives you this rifle, because part of this heart is to capture minotaurs and lindworms. Okay, and that's not what they're called. Drakes. Okay, Drakes. For the arena here in Ashford, and this weapon set right here. Look at this weapon. Lick this weapon set. It's delicious. This weapon set, I could talk forever on this, but I won't. I'll talk about one specific thing here. But this weapon set, for real, while we're getting to the Minotaurs, go to this heart and pick up this weapon set and ask yourself, and try to convince yourself that this wasn't actually what the engineer had at one point, like in Alpha 2009 or something. And look at it, and look at how well cued everything is. Look at the conditional effects, and more importantly, look at this number 5 skill that we're going to look at. We're talking about skill functionality changes. This is actually called jump shot. And this jump shot knocks, if you strike a target with this jump shot, both you are knocked down and the target is knocked down. It also has a very long range, and the reticle is also pre-buff jump shot. Like, the original reticle size, the radius size for this reticle is 150. It's still 150. This is the original jump shot. So let's actually use it on this Minotaur. And if you notice, I'm knocked down about 2 seconds, and this Minotaur's knocked down for like straight up 6 seconds, which is just excessive in every single way of the word. Excessive, it's too much. But in any case, though, the point of me bringing this to you is, well, actually there's one more thing. It's kind of funny because, like, I mean, it says hit them, so there's the landing shot and there's the jumping shot, and if you just like use the jumping shot, you also inflict the knockdown, which is completely bogus, because who's gonna see you run up to you? Who's gonna see the guy run up to you and press the 1/4 second jump shot cast and knock you down? But the reason I came to show you this, though, is this is jump shot. Straight up, this is actually called jump shot. It behaves very similarly, or identically, honestly, to like the original jump shot. Like, when the game was released, this is like exactly how jump shot worked, except, I mean, the animation rather. And notice, I don't actually knock myself down if I don't hit anyone. I just do the regular jump shot animation. Can you imagine, this is the question for you, what if there was a trait, like a Master in Firearms for Engineer, that if you took that trait, this is what your jump shot on rifle became? Instead of the one that actually deals an absurd amount of damage, like you're going for damage, why don't we get a CC version of jump shot? Big, huge, big ol' leap, skill shot, not quite as huge radius. You get knocked down, target gets knocked down. It's an option. More importantly, it's a sacrifice option. It's something that requires coordination with your team and everything. And so the rest of this, I mean, I'm going to cut this short because I have a 15-minute limit on these things. So I'll post the rest of the stuff in the thread, and the discussion will be there. So until next time, there's your question. What about these side grade traits?